All right. So,
I'm going to give you a
This
nice
meeting is being
introduction, though.
recorded.
oh, okay.
I'm going to give you a nice introduction before we start.
Don't
Uh,
embarrass me, please.
oh, no, no, no. Uh, you all, thank you again for being here. I always love
Sure.
seeing a group of teachers after school because I remember what that feels like. It's exciting and you're exhausted as well. So thank you for being with us. I've had a little time to talk with Heather Vickers, who is our presenter today. And I know that just from the few minutes I've had with her, you are really going to enjoy this today. But let me tell you a little bit about her. Heather Galloway Vickers is an artist and an art educator. Her teaching experience includes 11 years of post-secondary at the University of Indianapolis, DePaul University, as well as Purdue University. She also taught students in preschool through 12th grade for 8 years in Indianapolis. And Heather, we love teachers in our own area out there doing those things. That's great. She also received her bachelor's in studio art and art history from DePaul in Greencastle, Indiana, an MFA in painting and drawing from Northwestern University, and a master's from the University of Indianapolis, and a PhD in art education from Purdue. Her artwork, I'm actually going to put that in the chat room. You can find at her website, heathervickers.com. So I'm going to turn it over to you now. And as always,
Okay.
if you all have questions as we go, please feel free to put them in the chat box. I'll be monitoring that, and we'll have an opportunity to talk and so forth. And I'll be quiet, Heather, and turn it over to
Oh,
you.
no, that's fine. That's fine. Yeah, the introductions just, it makes me laugh because both my parents are deceased, but they would just be like, are you ever going to be finished with school? Because I just finished actually my PhD a couple of years ago, just thought I'd do that for the next, for 5 years. So anyone out there that's mid 40s, mid 50s, it's doable. Takes a little work, but I'm sure you're all lifelong learners like myself. So, because you're teachers. Okay, so this presentation is going to start with the Romantic period. Last time we talked, we covered neoclassical. If you joined us for that session, I've got notes here that I'm going to read because if I don't, I'm going to be way off course and then we won't get a lot in here. But the last session with neoclassical, the style that we looked at, it was very grand scale, classical details like Roman columns, simplicity, Greek columns, that sort of thing. But along with Romanticism, today we're going to talk about other styles. So we're going to talk about Realism, and then the Pre-Raphaelites, very interesting group, arts and crafts movement, which has some history here in the United States, of course, and Impressionism. I tried to highlight anything from I think I found a few things from the Cincinnati Museum of Art, several things from Chicago, the Art Institute, so make it a little bit more relevant for the area. And I'm just trying to go to my next page here. What am I doing? All right, there we go. It's not hard, just push this button. Okay, so this is a timeline that we've been working on. We started really with Baroque, if you remember, went all the way up through the Golden Age, Dutch Golden Age, Rococo, several other things, neoclassicism, and now we're landing here at Romanticism. It arrived around or began around 1800, and we're actually going to end with Impressionism, which was ushered in with Monet's Impression Sunrise, and that was painted in 1872. So it's less than 100 years, but many styles emerged during this time period within Western Europe and also the United States. The influence was here as well. But of course, like always, I'll give you the caveat. It's important to remember that, this is a Western point of view. There was art happening throughout the globe and throughout many other cultures in every country. So I think, when I was back in school, we just learned the Western viewpoint of art history, and it's so much more expansive now. So, all right. Okay, so starting here, the style of Romanticism lasted from 1800 to 1900. So it did last for that entire 100 years that I was talking about. Today, the word romantic means love to us, but the implication was different during that time period. The word Romanticism was first used in relation to literature, music, and in the beginning of the 19th century, art came under this heading. Later, as artists explored various emotional and psychological states as well as moods, and artists creating in this style explored diverse subjects and worked in varied styles. So realism today for us is different, but if you look back then, it was something that was encouraged by the idealism actually of the French Revolution. The style embraced the struggles for freedom, equality, and justice. And artists began using current events and tragedies to show injustices in often large and dramatic compositions. And some of the most well-known Romantic artists include Goya, who is the image here is by Géricault, Friedrich, Turner, and Delacroix. All these are men. There were a few women, I'm sure, that have not really been discovered during this time period. In the other time periods, I did dig up some other people that I'd like to talk about, some women that aren't as well known. In this particular one, this is an aquatint by Goya. He produced a suite of 80 prints, different prints, and this was the 43rd. It was a literary effort as well as combining with his visual artist skills. The Sleep of Reason produces monsters. It's probably his most famous of the whole group, and he intended it possibly as a self-portrait. And this man appears to be asleep peacefully as darker images as bats and cats are flying around his head as if they were from his nightmares. The Spanish artist, so Goya was Spanish, also completed this painting. The subject was taken from a tragic event. The event occurred after Napoleon formed a false alliance with the King of Spain. Napoleon removed the rightful king of Spain and made his brother the new king of Spain. On May 2nd, 1808, hundreds of Spanish civilians rebelled against the French army. The next day, on May 3rd, many of the rebels were rounded up and captured by the French army and were shot at sunrise. So that's the scene that's depicted here. Goya was outraged. He actually painted this. It has now become a masterpiece. I think he meant it more as a warning or information or something more current than what we think of it now. But it has been called the world's first modern painting. And it's been portrayed or praised for its portrayal of man's inhumanity to each other, and also for its modern translation of Christian iconography. So in the painting, the French soldiers have their backs to us, lined up very anonymously. Then their rifles are actually pointing straight at this figure. And they are very dark, the soldiers, and muted in their colors. And the central figure is really brightly lit from a single lantern, but it seems almost like a spiritual light. And he, before he's shot, he stretches out his arms as in, the crucified Christ. And his hands actually have stigmata or holes, the same that were seen in Christ's hands during his crucifixion. So the thing is, here in Romanticism, Goya's portrayal was not idealized, but as heroic, but actually just treated as the brutality as it was. It still remains emotionally charged for the viewer. And actually later artists, Manet and Picasso, used this painting actually to portray some of the events during their lifetimes. Another theme of Romanticism was catastrophic events. During the Romantic period, there was a reoccurrence of images such as shipwrecks and man's struggle with nature, with the power of nature. And Géricault is the artist here, and it's the Raft of Medusa. And it was an actual event that took place in 1816, July of 1816. The Medusa was a French ship, and it was wrecked off the coast of West Africa. And a raft was quickly built on the ship before it sank to bring 150 of the passengers to safety. But all the passengers made to get on the raft were of lower class, while all the upper class passengers and the officers of the ship were in the few life boats available. So sounds familiar to us, that story. The lifeboats were meant to tow the raft, but when the lifeboat passengers realized they couldn't make it to the shore towing that raft, they cut the ropes and just left this raft out, and it just was in the water for days. And these poor people, they were left out to drift at sea. There's only 15, actually only 15 out of the 150 passengers actually lived. The story was reported in the newspapers, and it really horrified the public. But it's extremely large, as in some of the historical paintings that we've seen before. It's 16 feet by roughly 23 feet. It has a very strong diagonal with the bodies, the arm gestures, ropes, and the sail, making the composition of the painting a large pyramid. So lots of action. That was very typical of the Romantic style. A man waves a piece of red and white fabric in an attempt to signal a tiny ship, if you can see it to the right on the horizon. Many people are dead or dying. There was even cannibalism happening on the raft. They were out there so long. Those on the left side that are still alive, seem like they've lost hope. There's a man there kind of in the foreground, and he's holding on to his dead son's body. Other bodies are shown submerged in the water, and the painting actually was well received in an exhibition in Paris in 1819. But something this large and this graphic and a realistic portrayal of the actual event had never been seen before. A little bit easier to take is Caspar David Friedrich, German. He was also a Romantic painter, so it looks very different from the emotional compositions that we just took a look at. He really looked at the strength of nature, and the Sea of Ice was painted to depict a shipwreck in the Arctic. A subject usually, well, it was pretty unusual for the time. The painting was unpopular actually when it first was shown, and it remained unsold during the artist's life. But by contrast, today, it's actually considered one of his most famous pieces. But it's based on close observation, portraying nature's power and the unpredictability of icebergs. It was most likely based on Friedrich's knowledge about the British explorer Parry and his expedition to the North Pole in 1827. If you look in the foreground, there's multiple layers of small icebergs that he probably just imagined and or probably saw around him, maybe in rivers and that sort of thing. In the middle ground are these large pieces of broken icebergs that form a tower of ice. And you kind of feel like something terrible has happened or something has sunk. And it's really difficult to see, but over on the right-hand side by the massive tower is a tiny part of a wrecked ship. So if I don't know if I can point it out to you, but it kind of looks like almost like a dark wing, but it's the bow, I believe, of the ship. So you see just a part of it. Continuing with the idea of weather, Turner was an English Romantic painter, J.M.W. Turner, or today we just call him William Turner. And he was known for expressive color, imaginative landscapes that were turbulent and often violent seascapes. He was intensely private and an eccentric type of reclusive person. He was a controversial figure throughout his career because he was from a lower middle class family. But he was a child prodigy and started studying art when he was 14. He completed over 2,000 paintings, 19,000 drawings and sketches. But he really became famous and is well loved by the British today for his use of swirling colors and the dynamic nature of his paintings. This painting actually captures the Great Western Railroad, which I've been on, and it looks nothing like this. But this was at a time when it was considered like an industrial wonder, just amazing seeing this engine coming down the tracks in the whirling atmosphere is made up of the rain and then the steam actually from the train as it speeds across a bridge. And then it's also in a storm. People thought that Turner was commenting on human creation and nature becoming one force. He was impressed by the innovations of the industrial age. and sometimes it's people have a difficult time with this painting because it's a little difficult to interpret, but hopefully you can see the train a little bit farther to the left is the bridge and the tracks, and so you get the idea. Some of it because you look at it and it just seems like atmosphere, and that's all that there is. Another French romantic painter was Delacroix, and his particular painting here is Liberty Leading the People, and it was to commemorate a three-day revolution in 1830. And it was completed actually in the same year. So it again was a story, a current story. A female figure with her yellow dress is slipping, her dress is slipping down over her bare breasts, is centrally placed. I know when I show it to students in college, they don't understand, and it's kind of hard to think like that, like, why is her clothes coming off? So we always have some good discussions about that, but she holds a bayoneted musket in her left hand and raises the French flag with her right, but she's really a symbolic allegory of freedom. And it's probably familiar to us because it's the same pose as the Statue of Liberty, which was also French. So as a powerful figure, she's moving forward and her head turns to the side as she's trying to check on those that follow her. If you notice in the crowd that the people surrounding her, there's all different types of economic status, and you can tell by their clothes. The man on the far left, who has sort of a white sash with his arm there, I think a gun or a musket gun or something poked in it, and then a cap. He obviously is a factory worker, but next to him is an affluent man wearing a black top hat, white shirt, you know, this kind of tailored black coat, and he too is out there fighting alongside the other people. Delacroix made it clear that this revolution wasn't just for the economically stricken or downtrodden. He also included children who were also part of the fight, as you see the ones to the right, or the young boy to the right. And then further on the right, you can see the symbol of France, which is Notre Dame or Notre Dame, which can be seen, you know, far in the distance. Okay, so that's my last Romantic period. So you sort of get the gist that the Romantic period is full of strong emotion, not love, but strong emotion. After the Romantics, the period of Realism became popular. And of course, it was a reaction to the Romanticism. And it was adopted by Western European and American artists in the middle of the 19th century. It was based on a direct observation of everyday life, and realism rejected anything overly emotional and grandiose, such as those of the Romanticism or Romantics. Artists at this time attempted to portray objective and truthful versions of contemporary life. So this realism actually came back about after another revolution in 1848 in France called the February Revolution. And the monarchy collapsed. At this time, there was civil unrest and a fight for democracy and reform. And so the artists were really trying to support that reform by depicting common working class in their art. So Gustave Courbet, who painted the Stonebreakers, stated that the painting is essentially concrete art and can only consist in the representation of real and existing things. Realists recorded the gritty existence of poor people, and you can definitely see it in this painting. Courbet had a deep concern for the lives of the poor, as these two laborers are depicted breaking and moving stones by hand. Sadly, actually, this painting was destroyed, which you probably saw there in Dresden. It was in a transport with about 150 other paintings. The Germans were actually moving it, and then the Allied forces bombed, and it was obliterated in World War II. So this is the only image really that's left of it. Courbet also did other work that is very well known today. This is a burial at Ornez, which is a kind of the same vein. It portrays ordinary people in the same scale. Actually, that was reserved for history painting in the past, because this painting is actually over 21 feet wide. Some of the critics thought that Courbet's painting was directed against industrialization at the time, which was thought to keep much of the civilization poor. So this painting shows middle-class citizens of a small town standing around an open grave, if you notice in the center at the bottom of the canvas. And then you can almost see in it. And when you see it, it's such a large painting, it's almost as if you could step in it. A grave digger kneels at the side of the grave. The altar boys, the officiants, the townspeople, and even the dog look thoroughly bored. So Courbet is really showing the viewer, us as the viewer, a funeral being conducted with little spirituality or reverence or any sort of glory of salvation. So it's pretty stark. Millet was another artist, and you probably are really familiar with this image. And he worked at the same time as Courbet, but he painted scenes of rural life. And what he showed were peasants at work in rustic scenes such as this. And even though it's so well loved by us today, the painting created actually a scandal, which is really hard to think about when it went on exhibition. And the reason why it was such an honest depiction of rural poverty, the bent postures of the peasants, trying to pick up the extra grain, emphasize the physical hardship of their labor. To us, it just seems beautiful and peaceful, but at that time period, they saw it in a much different way. He actually was, you might have seen on the timeline, the Barbizon School. He was the founder of that, which was basically a group of realist artists that were interested in landscape and rural France. And Millet himself was a part of a farming family. And so one of the things that really appealed to us as viewers are that his scenes of plowing, sowing, and other farm labor are really created with a high degree of accuracy. He also painted this one. This one's one of my favorites, I think, because I love the color, the redness, and then the way that the figures, I don't know, just kind of swinging. You can imagine him throwing, sowing grain or seed at the time. But this is really a famous subject of Millet. He repeated it several times. And Millet felt that the subject expressed a religious belief, as in sowing the word or something along those lines. But once again, it aroused a storm of controversy when it appeared in Paris in 1850, which hard for us to understand. But the viewers were shocked because he was treating this young, poor, lowly peasant very heroically. And so just that change of viewpoint was very shocking to the public. So anytime there's such a situation where there was rural poor being just kind of degrading, it sort of was sensed to be like a socialist threat, if you can think of it, against the wealthy. So it threatened their status. And that's a little bit hard of a concept for us to think about today. A woman that I dearly love is Rosa Bonheur. And she painted in a realistic style. This is actually a painting, and when you look at it, it looks so much like a photograph. But another painter painted her, but I wanted to show you this because it shows her, she's just kind of this typical woman in a smock that's in this, huge studio with very large paintings around her. When women like Rosa sought professional careers as artists, they were restricted from attending public academies for the basic reason that there were live nude male models there. And so women could only turn to instruction from established artists or private academies. And if a woman artist had a supportive and encouraging family, then they could withstand some of the social strain that they were subjected to. And luckily, Rosa's father was a trained artist who trained her. He was a drawing teacher and a landscape painter, and he really believed in gender equality. She was actually one of the most famous French realist artists, man or woman of the 19th century. And she made her reputation by specializing in animal painting and was known for her very large formats, which you can see here. She exhibited in Paris and the United States and also Britain. but my favorite, absolute, of course, because it has horses in it. And you can go see this. This is in New York in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. But this painting is called or titled "The Horse Fair," and it's her most famous work. Interestingly, it was bought in 1887 by American Cornelius Vanderbilt for $53,000, which seems like a lot to us now, but it was actually 1.5 million today. So that's how it ended up in the United States. It took Rosa 3 years to finish it, and it's 8 feet tall, a little over 16 feet wide. And the painting shows a horse market. It was held in a street, kind of at the end of the street in Paris on this sort of tree-lined boulevard. And she would go there twice a week to sketch, but she would always dress as a man to discourage attention. And she actually had to get permission from the police, the Paris police, to do that. But that, is really considered one key to her ability to capture the movement and the likeness of the animals, is that she was there spending a great amount of time sketching live animals. Today, she's really celebrated for breaking gender and stereotypes. Here's another one, because I just couldn't help but show you one more. This one actually was one of hers that became a big sensation after it was exhibited, and the museum in Luxembourg bought it. And it was also at the 1889 World's Fair in Paris. And all of that really amplified her reputation. Later, though, realism eventually went out of style. People kind of forgot her. Feminists in the 70s kind of revived her story, like Linda Nuckland's essay, "Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists?" And then again in the late 90s with Mary Bloom's New York Times article, "The Rise and Fall of Rosa Bonheur." So a little bit about her. Let's look at America for just a moment. So some American realism here by Thomas Eakins. Along with French realism, American artists had always maintained actually the style of realism since the country's inception. So we don't really see anything other than realism at that point. And it really has become an important part of our history as we look back to see the representations of those people and their activities and political thoughts and their feelings. But Eakins was an American realist. He studied actually at the Pennsylvania Academy of Art. And then, like most of the American artists, he went to Paris. Eventually, he set up a studio in Philadelphia in his childhood home and lived there the rest of his life. But he disliked idealization, any sort of romanticism. He loved meticulous detail of humans and nature. And he was actually using, at the time, photography as a resource, which was very rare at that point. This is called the Bigland Brothers Racing, and it was inspired by outdoor sports. And Eakins was an avid rower himself. He created a series of paintings of male athletes, such as these brothers. And it's the places where he's created them, the landscape is actually identifiable in the Philadelphia area. And he actually painted 14 paintings of rowers. This next painting, though, is much different, a little shocking. Again, by Thomas Eakins, another American realism, example of American realism. This is called the Gross Clinic, and I used to think as a younger college student that the Gross Clinic was like gross, and that's why it was called that, but that actually was not the truth. It was the local physician, and you can see his the name up there, Samuel Gross. So he was the surgeon. He's overseeing a surgery being performed by assistants. And while he's lecturing to a class of medical students, he was trying to highlight medical sanitary procedures at the time. Now that we look at it and they don't have masks or gloves, it doesn't look very sanitary with all those people around. But at the time, that was the best way, I guess. So it's a visual record. He was very good at portraiture. So all the individuals in the room, in the theater are known, including the students, the assistants, and even that horrified woman to the left, who was a spectator. I've read that she was an assistant, and then I've also read that she was related to the patient. Not quite sure about that. But it was really rejected by some. in the area because it was so gruesome. But just like curiosity today, humans, many viewers of the painting were really captivated by it. It was such a convincing painting, individual representations. It had this psychological intensity to it. And he was just eerily able to portray in honest detail, this realistic, but kind of not so appetizing scene. If you can imagine, I just can't imagine like not having a whole lot of aesthetics and things like that. It would have been just horrendous. A woman, American realist, Elizabeth Morse, she was actually born in Cincinnati, Ohio, getting down in your area in 1859. She showed really young promise at a young age, and she went to art school at 15. She also traveled like they all did to Paris, but she stayed there. She didn't want to be an art teacher, which a lot of artists did. She did not like the feminist impressionists of the day, so she didn't really hang around those people. She concentrated only on her work in the hope of being taken as a serious artist. She did find some success. Her distinctive subject matter were realistic portraits, landscapes, and both of those earned her some fame. In 1888, she exhibited in Paris, and she really is a part, just like Rosa, of a new group of female artists from the 19th century who were successful, technically well-trained, and stayed unmarried. The Fisher Girl to the right, which is one of my faves there, was painted in northern France from a model. She actually had a model out there in a bitterly cold day in the wind. And the model actually cried, I guess, during the time because it was so cold, but the artist stayed out there and painted. But their faces look really red and like they are experiencing the coldness of that coastal wind. And the woman with the harp to the left is located in the Cincinnati Art Museum. And today, little is known about the painting. So if you're interested in being an art detective, you could maybe look into that one. Okay, our next area is the Pre-Raphaelites, or initially they called themselves the Brotherhood of Pre-Raphaelites. It was invented by an informal group of English artists. And Pre-Raphael actually meant that the group was focused on the style of art before Raphael was painting. They wanted to include serious and significant subjects. So that's why they gave themselves that name. They were best known for painting subjects from literature, and they often used historical costumes. They painted directly from nature as representationally as possible with hyper attention to detail, which makes their work, I think, very charming. It was common at the time for artists to work outside their studio, outside making sketches, but they would bring them back in their studio to create their large canvases, their paintings. But the Pre-Raphaelites actually finished the painting outside, which with all that detail and as a painter, I just couldn't imagine. So, but they liked the plein air or open air. This was by Gabriel Rossetti, and he was one of the leading figures in the Pre-Raphaelites. He actually had an affair with the model in this painting, who is Jane Burns Morris that I list there. She was married to William Morris, who was an English designer that we'll talk about here in just a minute. And it created a huge love triangle. It was very scandalous. So that brought a lot of attention to the Pre-Raphaelites. In the painting, though, Jane appears really kind of disproportionately large. And I always wondered, like he desired the viewer to focus on her beauty of her face, but yet her neck was very elongated and it's kind of at a natural angle. So I always felt that was really curious. And her hands are really twisted and intertwined in a very unnatural way as well. They considered the background secondary in importance, but there's lots of detail there. But really the figure fills up almost the entire picture plane. You might be familiar with this one, Ophelia, who was by John Everett Millais, who was another founding member member of the Pre-Raphaelites. So this kind of has a sad story. It's based on the story of Ophelia, but the model for this painting was Elizabeth Siddal, which I wrote her name there as well, typed it in, and she was an artist herself. A lot of the women artists at this time associated with this group, and they also modeled for them. So she had to lie in a tub of warm water inside, like in a bathtub, and he would paint her in a gown that he had bought, a very intricate gown in like a secondhand store. But at one point, the heating actually failed. So there wasn't a water heater at the time. And so the water was really cold, and he made her stay in there for quite a while. And she developed a serious fever, and was very sick for a while. So she had been his model for had been Rossetti's model for several years, but eventually she married this artist, Millais. And so Millais, after they were married, was constantly paying attention to other women. And so Elizabeth actually suffered from depression, of course, and chronic illness. She was addicted to opium at the time, which was prescribed to her, and then she became addicted to it. She died from an overdose of laudanum. I can never say that right, but a derivative of opioid. But after she delivered a stillborn baby, so they don't know, if she took her own life or it just was an accidental overdose. But anyway, her life was as sad as Ophelia in the story. But this artist helped kind of put the Pre-Raphaelites on the map. They were really popular with the public, especially these kind of romantic paintings, and they had such an intense attention to detail. And he was also admired as the paintings were meditations on kind of the idealness of life and of beauty. But his work was not liked by everyone at the time, and he did receive some negative reviews. So it was kind of mixed too, but they were kind of involved in quite a bit of scandal if you read about them. So there's the brotherhood, and then this is what I call the sisterhood of the Pre-Raphaelites. Emma Sandys was part of the group, and then Maria Stillman. There were several others, but these women associated with the brotherhood. Sandys had a brother, Frederick Sandys, and he was one of the brotherhood. His work was selling well. Emma painted portraits of women and children, and her work was really of the same quality. A lot of times they shared the same studio and the same props and the same models and things like that. But unfortunately, her work was always attributed to her brother. And so until recently, for instance, this painting, the portrait of Mary Emma Jones, was attributed to her brother. So now art historians are trying to untangle that. The other woman, Maria, before her marriage, she modeled for the Pre-Raphaelites. After she married, she became more of a serious artist, concentrating on female figures, Italian landscapes, and scenes from literature. And this is Love's Messenger. So as you can tell, a dove has just carried in a love letter, so very romantic in that sense, from an open window. He uses a lot of symbolism, such as roses and doves and ivy and different things. It's kind of beauty, but yet the faded beauty is what the symbolism really points to. But this is considered her most important work, but it is a beautiful work. And I read that it's a watercolor, and I keep looking at it, and it's just amazing. So I keep thinking it's not, it's oil, but it is a watercolor. Something you may be familiar with is the arts and crafts movement, which I absolutely love. It began in England, second half of the 19th century, and it really spread as a new appreciation of decorative arts throughout Europe and also the United States. Collectively, it's known as the arts and crafts movement. But it was really formed by a collection of artistic societies like guilds and craftspeople and workshops and industrial companies that had a lot of talent. In the 1860s, many of the artisans and consumers were really disturbed by the lack of craftsmanship in what was being built. There was a decline in public taste after the Industrial Revolution. Goods were a lot cheaper, mass produced, but they didn't have style or individuality. So the arts and crafts movement looked back to a time before craftspeople were replaced by machines. The movement encompassed many art forms such as designs for houses, so architecture, fabrics, wallpaper, furniture, handmade books, and other decorative arts. And this is the man that I told you we would talk about, and his wife, and Rossetti. But William Morris was an English designer who was really kind of in the forefront. He founded a decor manufacturer, which is on the right there. In 1861. He actually worked with others. It was initially called the Morris, Marshall, Faulkner and Company, but he bought the others out. Even Rossetti was part of the collaborative effort, so it was all mixed in together. Let's see, the company was run as an artist collaborative, and many of their designs were copied by other designers. But eventually Morris became the primary designer, and he continued to find experts to develop his idea. And his daughter, May, who I want to show you this next one, was actually a very talented embroiderer. She was taught by her mother, and she showed early in a promise as an artist as well as a craftsperson. So at the age of 23, she supervised all the embroidery operations of the Morris and Company, and her designs and portraits are represented in this slide, and some are still available today. So she really spent much of her time designing wallpaper and textiles for her father's company. But if you embroider at all, this is amazing stuff. And then I wanted you to look at this. This might seem kind of familiar. I have probably a cheaper knockoff version of the one on the right, the modern Morris chair. I love it, the arts and crafts style. But Morris actually was the kind of inventor. There were several men that worked together, but it was took 3 years after the founding of the company that this chair began to be produced, and it was just acclaimed as one of the most comfortable chairs in existence. It was really the first reclining chair, and it was cushioned. It was very comfortable. And this chair on the left, the original one, stayed in production until the company closed in 1940. But again, you still see it today, and it's still very popular today. You can get the end tables and all that stuff with it. This is a beautiful room that Morris actually designed. He was a supporter of the Victorian and Albert, or the V&A Museum in London. And the museum asked him to design a room, which later becomes the dining room, and you can still have dinner there today. And he came up with the design for the green room, and now it's called the Morris Room. But he envisioned it to bring enchantment for all, a place where culture and beauty reigns. And so when you look at it, it just, if you love arts and crafts, it just has all the elements there. The lavish decoration, a well-crafted room with details. This was really his first major work as a commission. The museum's director at the time recognized his work and the simplicity and truth in his ideas. And so this space and 2 other spaces were designed by Morrison. Like I said, they still function today as the museum's restaurant. So very gorgeous. Okay, we're going to move on to something a little more radical, the Impressionists, but I want to talk about kind of the bridge from realism to the Impressionists, and that really involves Manet. And he was a French painter. I forgot the accent on the E there, but he was a French painter. A lot of my younger students I know in grade school would be like, there's not a Manet, it's a Monet. And I'm like, no, it's a different person. So, but his work, he was quite a bit older than the Impressionists. He broke new ground by defying traditional techniques of representation. He chose subjects from events of his own time, and again, that was controversial. And this particular painting, The Luncheon on the Grass, was extremely controversial, which it probably still would sort of be today. It's a depiction of a nude female fully clothed, or she's not fully clothed, but the men around her are fully clothed. So that's what really made it controversial. It was displayed in a exhibition that was actually organized by the Impressionists when they were refused from the normal Salon or Paris exhibition, then they would make their own exhibitions. And this was actually, once it was kind of rejected, he went ahead and showed it with the Impressionists. And so many of the Impressionists actually exhibited along with them at this time. So it was offensive, the stark nudity of the woman in contrast to the men, but also Manet used familiar models. So these people, like, they weren't changed at all. They were walking around Paris. They knew who these people were. The men in the painting were actually Manet's brother and his brother-in-law. So they were known as well. It was also a time of rampant prostitution in Paris. So that also made it really taboo, the subject, and then, you know, much less to even display it on a canvas. And then in the background, you kind of have this figure that is not the right scale. She seems kind of large, and it's somewhat unclear. It's supposed to be either a muse or some sort of goddess or something along those lines. But as you can tell that the, you know, he's very realistic, but his painting style is becoming a little bit more open than what we saw before. Let me show you this painting by him at the railway. This one's in Washington at the National Gallery. This depicts actually one of the largest and busiest train stations in Paris. In the background, you can't really see that that's what this is because of all the steam and smoke. But it serves as a background for the depiction of this woman and child. So if you look at the brushwork here, you can start seeing a loosening to it. Critics didn't like this painting because they didn't understand what was going on in the back. Again, you know, we're going to get to the Impressionist. So he was sort of giving us a little forward glance at that, you know, the idea of that impressionism of like a train station, right? The figures are backed by the black bars of an iron fence, so they're kind of isolated as the steam of clouds go up and the trains passing below. Again, the woman was Manet's favorite model, so she was recognizable. The child was the daughter of a fellow painter who allowed Manet to use his garden, so he painted there to create some of the railway. The composition actually is pretty complex when you look at it. The child is in a white dress trimmed with blue, a blue bow, and the woman is dressed in dark blue trimmed with white. The child is sort of anonymous. She's facing towards the train. The woman's facing towards us and actually holding our gaze, which was something that really was very new and disliked by the public. Both of their hair is different. The girl's hair is bound by a narrow ribbon. The woman has, you know, her flowing hair under her hat. So again, it was accepted actually, that and one other thing, into a watercolor, I believe, into a Paris exhibition at the time, but they were so critical of it, the reviewers. You know, at the time, Manet preferred to exhibit his work at the official salons without the Impressionists because he felt he could reach a larger audience of people, and he didn't really want to join this younger Impressionist group, you know. So at times he did, at times he didn't. But if you notice, really, as he's around the Impressionists more, the loose brushstrokes show the influence of these younger artists on his work. And the last area I want to look at are the Impressionists, which tend to be people's really favorite style. Impressionism is today considered one of the most important movements in modern painting. But in the 1860s, you know, when these young artists decided to paint, they just only wanted to paint what they saw, what they thought, what they felt. The original group included Monet, which this is a lovely portrait of his his wife with their son, and their family always looks very happy. I love to look at paintings of them. So it was Monet, Renoir, Pissarro, Sisley, Marisot, and other French painters. Eventually does, come to America, and I'll show you a little bit of that. But all these people worked together and exhibited together. They weren't interested in history or mythology or the lives of great men. They didn't seek perfection in their visual appearances. Instead, they wanted to get down on campus the impression of how a landscape or whatever they're painting, a thing or a person, appeared to them at that certain moment. It meant using a lot of lighter and looser brushwork. So that's one characteristic of Impressionism. Impressionists also painted outdoors, on plein air, or outside, and finished outside. That was a bit unusual, even though the Pre-Raphaelites were doing some of that as well. They also disliked the use of black, and then also their canvases, instead of starting with a really dark ground, like the canvas is painted a color before you start painting, their canvas would start white or off-white, and that was new, and that gave that sort of vividness, I think, to the painting. Initially, the public was very hostile to the group. The first, probably most famous painting was Monet's Impression Sunrise, and that was 1874. And it debuted actually in an art exhibit by the group. That there were over 200 works there of Impressionists, and they were seen by about 4,000 people, and then also by some critics. So Monet actually titled the painting. He didn't know what to title it. So he didn't want to give it a specific name because he knew that the viewers wouldn't be able to recognize exactly where it was. So he just called it Impression, and then the Sunrise. So it became Impression Sunrise. And then he also received accusations of it being unfinished and lacking descriptive detail. And so a critic actually used this word Impressionism as a negative term to describe the style, but instead Impressionism came to describe the moment or the movement. I love that when they take something negative and make it positive. But again, the characteristics are these short, thick strokes of paint that are made quickly to capture the essence of the subject rather than detail. It's often applied very thickly, or impasto is the technique. Colors are side by side, they're not mixed. And what they were trying to do is heighten the contrast or the vividness of the colors. If you know anything about simultaneous contrast, it was that theory. So complementary colors next to each other will appear the most, vivid. The paint was applied wet into wet, which wasn't done before. Usually artists would let their paintings dry between layers. And then also the last thing, the close attention was paid to the reflection of the colors from the object on the object. I wanted to show you this, and I know we were just talking about this before this session started, and there's going to be a trip to the Art Institute in Chicago. So I tried to pull up what they had there as far as Impressionists, and I didn't realize they had 6. I thought they had 3 of the wheat stacks, which everybody absolutely loves. A lot of times they're called hay stacks, but they actually were wheat stacks that were kind of piled up until they were processed. It took a while for, they had other people come into the fields and process the wheat. He actually completed 30 of the canvases. They were really popular here in the United States. So we actually have 20 of them. And then 6 of them are owned by the Art Institute of Chicago. Monet began painting the green stacks near the end of the summer of 1890 and painted them until the next spring. So almost a full year. His intent was to show differing light and atmosphere at different times of day and different seasons and types of weather. He worked on many this is at the same time. It was said, and I'm not sure if it came out of a journal or what, but he was getting up at like 3 a.m. to start working on this whole series of canvases, and he would repeatedly work on them each day, only for just a few minutes when that sun was, or the weather was a particular way, or the sun or the shadows were a particular way, and then he would go to the next one when he saw that. He did that quite often. If you look at of course, his water lilies, or these particular images in Giverny in France of most of his paintings there were from his gardens. He loved flowers and his fields surrounding his home. Interestingly enough, and I read this the other day, that the pond for his lilies, it was across the road from his house, and it was really kind of a drainage ditch at the time. And he did some of the work, and then he had some people, he never really had a ton of money, but he had some people help him block it, and he created that pond. So he turned something that was very ugly into something very beautiful. But here, and you've seen thousands probably of images of the Japanese bridge and the water lilies. Again, he was, in the process of working on the series, of canvases at different times of day, different weather. And he did this repeatedly, really for weeks up to months. So he wouldn't let go of a canvas until that whole series was done. This one's at the Art Institute as well. Renoir, one of people's favorites, a little bit different than, Monet. His colors are a little brighter and colorful. So this is two sisters, and then on a terrace, and it features a pair of young women, one a little bit older, obviously, and they look like they're sisters, but they actually were not sisters. They were models. Sorry to tell you that. They have a basket on their left, which has a lot of colorful wool yarns in it. So it really plays off of the artist's palette there. The elder young woman, stares really far off, while the younger one is sort of looking at us with a little bit more eager, and it really does kind of look like a sisterly moment, like the older is taking care of the younger. Renoir worked on this on a terrace of a restaurant located actually on a river in an island in a suburb of Paris. And over the railings, you can see the shrubbery, brightly colored, the water, the foliage. And then in 1880 to 1881, shortly before working on this, you might know Luncheon of the Boating Party, but this was exactly the same place that he painted the other paintings. So if you look at that painting, you'll see a resemblance. One woman French Impressionist painter, Berthe Maresot, is considered one of the greatest Impressionist painters. She was actually born into a wealthy family. This again is at the Art Institute. She exhibited her work at Paris salons. She joined the first Impressionist group show with Monet, Renoir, and the others. And she actually was in 7 of the 8 Impressionist group shows. This one was in the 5th exhibition, and she received great acclaim for it. Actually, Manet painted several portraits of her too, and she eventually married Manet's brother. So she often focused on domestic scenes. Her subjects were like soft, feathery brushstrokes, muted shades of lavender and pink, blue, white, and gray, and very delicate textures of the blonde hair, the satins, the powder puffs, the flower petals. And she worked mainly on a small scale. But her light and airy work was often criticized as being too feminine. Those critics, they have to say something, right? So she struggled really to be taken seriously as a female artist. And then her subject matter, which I think I just mentioned, but studies of women, children, gardens, fields, and even seaside vacation homes. One of probably all of our favorites is Mary Cassatt. And this one is at the Art Institute, and I only have one here just for the sake of time. This is running a little long, but Mary Cassatt was an American painter, even though she probably wanted to say that she was French, but she was born in Pennsylvania and spent her adult lifehood in France. She became a part of the Impressionist movement, even though she was an outsider, they did accept her. She was born into an affluent family. They didn't want her to become an artist. She became an artist. So she moved to Paris at 22, sought private instruction, spent her time in the Louvre copying paintings, the life, right? So she painted mostly women and children. So that's the theme she's best known for. She experimented with compositional elements of Japanese art. So some of the times the colors, the way things are framed or cropped, that comes from actually printmaking, Japanese printmaking. This is the child's bath. So it's a very intimate scene of life. And Cassatt doesn't do, overly sweet or, really feminine. It's always just kind of a feeling of tenderness and caring and protectiveness between the mother and the child. Her career was actually taking off when she joined the Impressionist. She was really outspoken in her dismay at the formal art system in France and Paris, because she felt that the female artists needed to befriend male patrons in order to move ahead. So on what level that, I'm sure you could take it on many levels, that befriending part. But throughout her life, Cassatt supported equality for women. She participated in an exhibition supporting women's suffrage, that sort of thing. I wanted to show you two last paintings that were American Impressionists. I don't know if people really realize that we actually had kind of an Impressionist movement here. William Merritt Chase is the first major American painter to create Impressionist canvases in the United States. And guess what? He was born in Indiana. I did not know that until I researched this, in 1849. And there were 6 children, and he was the oldest. He studied in Indianapolis and in New York at the Academy of Design. Actually, both his parents died when he was young, but he found a group of businessmen in St. Louis that actually sent him to Europe. But instead of Paris, he chose Munich. He just felt like he would be so diverted by the entertainment and the shows and all the life in Paris. He wanted to work in Munich. He came back to New York. He worked at the Art Students League, which was an important school that had just recently opened. This particular painting was created on Long Island, where he and his family stayed for several summers. He would teach 2 days a week and then spend the rest of his time painting. Wouldn't that be awesome? So it's just beautiful. The women and children are relaxing and playing on the beach. A perfect day is shown. The wide sky with clouds moving over the bright white forms of the women and the children, the colored forms of the children's dresses, and then the parasols. So you have kind of accent colors there. And then the last one, and John Singer Sargent did some amazing portraits that I absolutely love, but I just wanted to show you this particular one, which is another Impressionist painting. So actually Sargent, which I did not know this, I knew he was American, but he was born in Florence from expatriated American parents. They were expatriates. And so he studied in Paris. He was influenced by Monet's work and the Impressionist style. But in the United States, after the Civil War, as the United States, it's kind of hard to even think this, but we actually gained international political and economic status. And a lot of the Northerners made fortunes from the war, the munitions and all the different things that were needed. So they had kind of new money, they traveled abroad, they became art patrons. And they liked to pay particular attention to young American artists who studied in Europe, especially Paris. So Sargent, fit that perfectly. And so he also did lots of beautiful portraits, mostly of women. And so the sales of their work were really strong in America. And so in this particular one, again, you can see it's really kind of more of an American scene perhaps, but you have the wheat field and the reapers resting, and the brush strokes look very impressionistic. He painted it outside, so it has all those major characteristics. Ooh, that was a lot. Okay, 95 years in a nutshell. So that's the end of what I have. I was thinking next time that we're together, it'll be next month. If you're interested in going to the Art Institute of Chicago, I think I lived and worked there and painted there, or went to school there. so I'm going to kind of highlight some architecture, the Art Institute, some of their collection, just kind of give you a travel log of what maybe you could expect when you go there. So if that sounds like something interesting, I think
I
that
do
was
see some heads nodding on that.
March 22nd. Okay.
Yeah,
I
I
got some
think so
interesting
too.
stories for you. So not mine, historical ones.
Great.
All
We
right, so that's
actually,
what I have.
and Heather, thank you so much. This was so interesting. And I know some of you've been to all or some of these museums and you've seen this artwork and it's really fun to relive that. And I saw a lot of new things for me today, like, oh, I hadn't thought about it in that way or so forth. So thank you so much for sharing
Oh
those.
yeah, you're
Those
welcome. And
things. The evaluation link is in the chat box. And we really didn't have questions. We had some comments about things people loved and who their favorite artists or paintings were, that sort of thing. So appreciate your all's
oh yeah, thank you so much for all of your attention. And yeah,
yes.
the thing with art, there's always a backstory, and that's what I find the most exciting. If you dig around, you know, artists, they didn't have those typical lives, so it's always fun to see what they were up to. So try to
Absolutely.
highlight that.
Well, thank you all so much. Thanks for being here with us on this Wednesday evening and hope you have a great rest of the week. Heather, nice to meet
Yeah.
you and hopefully
Yes,
we'll
yes.
see you soon.
Yes, and thank you for everything you do for the children of Kentucky, all of you guys. So
Thank
see you
you.
soon.